2021 brought a trade deal. One middle-aged man in Oxfordshire brought the tantrum. And somewhere between those two events, a £6 million beef business quietly appeared in a field. Australian beef, he said on camera, was rubbish. Pure spite. Zero research. By any sensible media logic, that should have been the moment the credits rolled. This wasn't an outburst. It wasn't a throwaway joke. It was the opening shot in a business strategy. And a British government obsessed with trade headlines never saw it coming. To understand how the beef works, you have to start with what Clarkson actually wanted the farm to be. Arable, wheat, barley, rapeseed, crops that grow quietly in neat rows and don't kick you in the chest when you walk into the field. Things you can run largely with machinery and timing rather than veterinary science and nighttime panic. Sheep were an accident. A neighbor suggested grazing. Clarkson agreed, largely because the fields needed something woolly in them and the margins looked survivable. Sheep, in his telling, were manageable chaos. Cattle were not accidental. Cattle were a decision. And like most of his decisions, they arrived out of irritation rather than serenity. The UK-Australia Free Trade Agreement phased out tariffs on imported Australian beef over several years. On paper, this was modern liberal economics. In practice, to British farmers already squeezed by rising input costs and shrinking subsidies, it looked like the state inviting cheaper meat into the country and telling local producers to compete or die. Clarkson had spent a year finding out exactly how thin the margins already were on a British farm. He took it personally. If cheaper imported beef was coming, he decided, the only way to survive was to stop playing the same game entirely. Don't sell anonymous beef at anonymous prices. Sell something the supermarket shelf physically cannot offer. Grass-fed, locally reared, traceable back to a single field in Oxfordshire. Served in a building with his own name screwed to the wall. Beef that had never seen the inside of a shipping container. On paper, it was coherent. In practice, it meant a man who had owned a 1,000-acre farm for over a decade without personally touching a cow was about to become a cattle farmer. On camera. With no idea what that actually involved. He found out quickly. Buying the herd meant standing in front of serious cattle breeders while his land agent did the maths he refused to contemplate. Clarkson compared the price of a decent cow to a decent second-hand car, which tells you how he was still processing the idea of buying living assets that can die on you overnight. By his own admission, the first year of cattle ownership was carnage. It's been a year of total disasters on the cow front, he said. Absolute disasters. Because he didn't know anything. I shouldn't have had cows. It was a mad thing to have got. That line matters more than most people realize. He doesn't pretend competence he doesn't have. He never has. And it's precisely that honesty that turned a niche diversification into something the entire country ended up watching. The breed choice is where the story stops being about ego and starts being about craft. Every British beef farmer has wrestled with the same decision for half a century. Continental cattle. The huge, sculpted French muscle machines, or native British breeds, smaller, slower, but built for this exact wet green island. Clarkson went native. He chose the beef shorthorn. Once you strip away the Top Gear metaphors, the reasoning is quietly precise. Continental breeds were built for drier, more consistent climates across mainland Europe. They often need cereals and supplementary feed to finish properly, to put on the fat that makes beef taste like beef. Native British breeds, by contrast, finish on grass alone. No feedlots, no imported soya, just fields, rain, and time. The diet nature already wrote. For decades, the food industry pushed lean beef as the virtuous choice. Continental cattle suited that optics perfectly. But tastes shifted, and chefs quietly led the change. What they wanted wasn't leanness. They wanted marbling, fat running through the meat in fine threads. The thing that turns a steak from a pricey piece of shoe leather into an actual pleasure. And native breeds like the Shorthorn produce exactly that on nothing more exotic than English rain and English grass. So when Clarkson stood in a field and called Australian beef rubbish, he wasn't only being provocative for the cameras. He was, in his blunt way, saying out loud what British grass-fed farmers had been muttering under their breath for years. This was not the same product. It was a different category entirely. Not every cow on the farm was destined for the plate. There is a beef shorthorn on his land who, despite repeated attempts, has never managed to fall pregnant. By strict commercial logic, an infertile cow on a working farm is a liability. He kept her anyway. She lives as a four-legged named very expensive pet. It's a small detail, but it draws a line between running a farm as a spreadsheet and running it as a home. And Clarkson, when you actually watch the decisions, not just the jokes, keeps choosing home when it quietly matters. Then there is the catastrophe television almost never shows properly. Bovine tuberculosis, the quiet, grinding disaster of British livestock farming. It spreads partly through wildlife, and it has been wrecking herds across the West Country and the Cotswolds for years. When TB hits a herd, the consequences are immediate. Infected animals must be slaughtered. Movement restrictions clamped down. Years of careful breeding can vanish in one vet visit. Diddly squat was not spared. Emma Ledbury, the farm's dairy supplier, lost half her herd. The disease reached into Clarkson's own cattle, adding emotional shock to financial pressure. The margins that looked thin before TB looked almost imaginary afterwards. The badger question made this even harder to tell honestly. Badgers are, to most of the British public, beloved woodland mascots from childhood picture books. To farmers, they are often the vector for a disease that ends a herd. Clarkson knew how delicate that was. That was one of the most difficult areas to cover, he said. Because the badger is much loved by most people in the country, the only people who truly hate badgers are the ones whose livelihoods depend on cattle. He could have softened it. He didn't. And that is the hinge running through the whole beef story. He could have made a show about happy cows and green fields and left it there. Instead, viewers watch disease, slaughter, and fear alongside the sunsets. The failure is the product. That's the most counterintuitive truth in this whole enterprise. Every outbreak, every loss, every disaster is part of what made the eventual beef credible. You cannot fake that. You can only earn it the slow way, and then point a camera at it. Now the grudge turns into a business. Most British beef farmers sell cattle into a chain. Farmer to processor, processor to distributor, distributor to supermarket, supermarket to you. At every stage, a margin gets taken. By the time the steak hits the chill cabinet, the person who grew the animal has the smallest slice of the price. It has quietly bankrupted small farms for a generation. It's the exact chain Clarkson spent his first year complaining about, loudly and with good reason. His model slices most of that chain away. The cattle are reared on farm grass as clean as he can keep it. They are processed, and then they go straight to the customer through 2 doors he built precisely to avoid ever handing his beef to a supermarket buyer. Door 1 is the diddly squat farm shop. The beef sits beside potatoes, honey, and a burger sauce allegedly made from cows that definitely didn't die of boredom. It's a joke. It's also the pitch. This is not anonymous meat wrapped in plastic. This is a story you've already watched unfold. Door 2 is the farmer's dog. The pub he opened to serve food made only from local and farm-grown produce. There, the same beef arrives cooked, rested, and plated by a team who know exactly which field it came from. At a price that keeps the margin on his own balance sheet, not someone else's. This is what most people miss about celebrity farming ventures. Clarkson isn't selling beef like a supermarket sells beef. He isn't trying to win a race to the bottom. He's selling beef like a small, high-end producer sells beef. On provenance. On story. On the plain fact that you watched the actual field this animal grazed in on television for free. Through droughts, TB scares, and a man learning in real time how not to kill a cow by accident. That is not a marketing campaign. It is a trust campaign. And trust is the one thing his original enemies in this story cannot buy, however large their advertising budget. Crucially, the system works in both directions. The shop and pub don't just sell his own cattle. They need beef constantly in volumes his herd alone can't guarantee, especially in bad TB years or poor calving seasons. So the farm now works with a small cooperative of local producers, cattle breeders among them. They supply extra stock to keep plates full and shelves stacked. Clarkson's beef operation doesn't just profit Clarkson, it quietly stabilizes his neighbors' herds too. In a moment when a guaranteed buyer at a fair price, agreed without a supermarket contract department, is close to the rarest thing in British agriculture. For them, this isn't television, it's survival. Does it work perfectly as a business? No. The wider farm finances swing around like the weather. Year 1 delivered a profit so small it became a punchline. Later years lurched the other way as drought and disease wiped out margins that looked fine on paper in spring. Farming does not reward good intentions or expensive machinery. It rewards rainfall, timing, and luck. None of those things care how many series of Top Gear you fronted. But the beef operation itself has become one of the bright spots on that unpredictable ledger. Industry estimates put the value of the herd, the shop sales, the restaurant revenue, and the brand recognition at somewhere around £6 million. And the way he built it explains exactly why big supermarkets cannot simply copy it. They can undercut on price. They can import cheaper meat from anywhere on the planet and stack it high under fluorescent lighting. What they cannot do is show you 6 years of one man's genuine, sometimes heartbreaking relationship with the specific cattle in the specific field your steak came from. That is not a supply chain advantage. It is an emotional one. This year, that emotional advantage bought Clarkson something nobody predicted when he first shouted about that trade deal. Official partner status in Great British Beef Week, the national campaign celebrating local butchers and farm shop supply chains up and down the country. The farmer's dog now showcases its beef as part of that campaign alongside producers who spent entire careers earning recognition the hard way. His head butcher, his neighboring farmers, they have all become, by extension, spokespeople for British grass-fed beef as a sector, not just for one loud man's operation. It started as protection. It became an example. And that is the piece almost everybody missed. Now, if you've been finding this as fascinating as I suspect you have, here is the part most people who follow this story closely still haven't fully joined up. Remember the line that started it. Australian beef is rubbish. At the time, it sounded exactly like what his critics had always accused him of being. Loud, provocative, fact-light, designed to generate headlines rather than insight. In the narrow sense, they were right. He hadn't done a taste test. He hadn't read the trade figures. He said it because he was angry about a deal he thought would hurt British farmers. But look at what that anger actually did. It forced him to buy cattle he didn't understand. It forced him to choose a native breed for reasons that turned out to be commercially sound, not merely sentimental. It forced him to build a shop and a pub so he'd never have to sell into the chain he hated. It forced him to film disease and disaster rather than hide them, which is exactly what gave the eventual product its credibility. And it led eventually to a beef operation valued in the millions that his original target, the supermarket system, cannot replicate because they cannot manufacture the one thing that actually sold the meat. Years of honest, unglamorous, occasionally devastating television. It is not a grudge, it is a flywheel. He said something rash on camera because he was angry about a trade deal. By accident, stubbornness, and a refusal to lie about failure, he built the very thing he claimed British farming needed. Not a slogan, a working example. That, in the end, is the shape of Clarkson's post-BBC life. He rarely sits down to design the thing that succeeds. He simply